Hey, this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog UN Dispatch, talking with
Matthew Lee of Inner City Press, inside the United Nations.
Happy Election Day, Matthew.
Sure, it didn't really live up to some of the hype, but it was an exciting day.
Mm-hmm.
With a lot of press action, a lot of intrigue. So
the elections to which I refer are Security Council elections. How many seats were open?
Okay, we'll start with the basics. There are five.
Give us the basics and walk us through.
Let's go all the way back.
How one becomes a member of the Security Council.
Let's go all the way back.
Okay.
There's 15 members of the Security Council, 15 of which are permanent. You know, as we know.
5 of which are permanent.
Oh, really? You see, I'm off to a bad start already. Yeah, I was trying to break it down to this third thing. 15 members, the 5 permanent, the U.S., UK, France, China, and Russia. Then you have the 10 non-permanent, 5 of which each year come off. So it's sort of like staggered. It's like a corporate board where you'd have half leaving each time. So this year you had 5 coming off, and it's always done by regional group. Like basically although this was all set up and is anachronistic, it still is done by, they'll, for example, when a European comes off, a European goes on, which,
right,
as will become important, doesn't necessarily mean a European Union member, but they have, regional groups.
Right.
So in this case,
just kind of go through some of
sure,
these regional groupings. Like you have Africa,
sure,
you have Latin America.
Let's use the
Asia,
acronyms.
And then well,
let's use the acronyms. It's always better to start obscure and then become clear. GRULAC is the Grupo Latinoamericano, etc., representing Latin America.
GRULAC.
Then you have the most interesting acronym and grouping is WEOG, which was the most contested, and WEOG stands for Western Europe and Other Group, which means
being
other, essentially white Anglo-Saxon, non-European states. I don't know. Exactly.
Yeah, not exactly Anglo-Saxon.
I know. I was setting you up there, Mark.
Mark, you're Sephardic than anything else.
Just trying to make you look good there.
There you go.
I'm sorry. No, I'm going to be. It's been quite a process here. But you also have Australia. I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And there was actually
the United States, Canada.
Australia got, as will become important or not, as the case may be. Australia got 1 vote, even though they weren't running. And the reason is because their name is so similar to Austria, which was one.
There you go.
No,
That's good. Someone
and I actually learned today.
So
I never knew that Austria has a chip on its shoulder about being misunderstood for Australia, and one can buy a T-shirt that says, "Austria, we don't have kangaroos."
You know what? I have to confess, I was Google searching for some results today, and I inadvertently Googled Australia instead of Austria. So
you're one of those. You're one of the bad ones.
I am sorry to.
Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Yeah. No Vienna. So no, I'm very sorry. I've been making some mistakes, some on purpose, some not. But now we'll get to the brass tacks of it all.
Go.
Definitely, there were usually what happens in these things, as usually at the UN, there's no suspense because everything is worked out behind closed doors and is sort of by the groups. So in this case, for example, GRULAC got together and they, through a mysterious process, deemed Mexico to be their candidate. Therefore, there was only one GRULAC candidate. Therefore, Mexico won hands down. Same thing with the African group. They chose Uganda. Uganda is in.
No.
This left of the 3 remaining seats. They were contested. One was barely contested, and it's the Asian group, which had Japan facing off against Iran. Iran, actually, some thought that they weren't even really campaigning. It wasn't a very high-profile campaign. But late, in the middle of this week, a flyer of theirs surfaced that made it clear they were campaiging. Most people gave them
flyer.
No. It gets many people. Some people were offering money and chocolates in one case. So there was.
It's an acorn conspiracy. Is that right?
Oh, we can talk. Acorns can be on our agenda if you want. But but Japan. Actually, I should pull out my results. Japan, soundly trounced.
I believe it was like 152 to 32 votes. Could be something like that.
Iran got only 32 votes, and I have to say, actually, I only yesterday was speaking to a self-described, well-placed Arab ambassador predicting a higher vote count for Iran, but apparently it all fell apart for them. And even the OIC, I mean, normally what happens in these things, if, for example, although it's not a regional grouping, if something like the Organization of the Islamic Conference throws its weight behind a candidate, you're guaranteed their membership, Some said that Iran was trying to get the non-aligned movement to side with it. Clearly, no group really sided with them. And the important thing here, to get more serious, is that this is a secret ballot. So even if a group, I think, unlike some other things where if a group calls for unity, usually they'll get it because people will know who broke with the unity.
Yeah.
This is truly a secret ballot, although attempts will be made beginning as soon as we stop this taping to find out who voted which way. But basically people keep it quiet. So
yeah.
So for example, and then the other race, and there was a connector here, but we'll say this was the one that people really thought there was suspense around, and we even talked about it last time we spoke.
Yeah.
Had Austria, Turkey, and Iceland competing for 2 seats in the WEOG, Western Europe and Other States group.
Yeah.
And this was truly contested. All 3 candidates mounted vibrant campaigns. Iceland's being certainly the most visible here. I mean, they had flyers, CDs. They had an Icelandic food festival.
Right. Apparently, in the New York Times, they were talking about their delicious Icelandic cakes and pastries, which hopefully you were able to partake.
Oh, I definitely. Although in the ethics of it all, I left a lot on the table, but a lot
really?
Came off the table too.
This is a paragon of journalistic
breaking
ethics.
news.
If you can sort of prevent yourself and resist eating those delicious Icelandic cakes, you're the paragon of journalistic integrity.
No. Let me in full self-depreciation. I actually made a bet on Iceland and lost. So I knew, which is bad for journalistically, but it was only a small.
Very journalistically.
It was a small bet.
That is not journalistic integrity.
It was a small bet with a Turkish journalist, and I've yet to pay on it. So
okay.
And I even ran a disclosure, so that I had a conflict. Into this very office, that although Mark, you may have seen it in previous segments, but came Icelandic, a special envoy from Iceland and a staffer from the Icelandic mission. They were pitching the press.
Yeah.
They were working it. They were working the halls. The main thing that people began to say was that the near bankruptcy of Iceland was hurting its chances.
Yeah.
And when you break it down, it became sort of hard, like, what did this exactly mean? Did people doubt that Iceland could even, like, field the mission for the next few years, that they couldn't afford to, like, have a guy sit in the chair? Because, I mean, we have, Burkina Faso, not to pick on them, but they're on the council. They were just president earlier this year. So it's not, I think that the bigger idea was that Iceland, like Turkey and to some degree Austria, had made a number of financial commitments to relatively smaller states of bilateral aid, more or less in exchange for their vote. Although since the balloting is secret, it's very hard to prove how you voted. And I think that's, in fact, after the loss. Well, no, maybe we haven't announced it yet. Maybe we can keep the suspense going. We didn't say who lost. So there was all the run-up.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we've gotten ahead of ourselves. In all the run-up, and Turkey was present, but was less so. Austria brought in its foreign minister, who, by the way, is like a 6 inch tall woman in bright white sneakers. She spoke only today in the stakeout in front of the General Assembly and was asked about Austria's right-wing leanings, and with aplomb said, "Our foreign policy doesn't change." So she didn't, whatever. And in fact, I'm going to cut as in trying to report out, i.e., find out how people were going to vote. Obviously, the reporters here, you call countries, you talk to them. Everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. The most troubling thing, and rather than leave this in suspense for last, I'll say it. It seems like a blogging head's kind of a nugget. The nugget is as follows: only yesterday, the permanent representative of an Afro-Arabic member state said that, in fact, this right-wing / almost neo-Nazi, or sometimes presented as anti-Israel, trend in Austrian politics, while seemingly weighing against their candidature in some minds, with his colleagues, some of his colleagues, actually is a plus.
Interesting, because you look at, and again, we haven't announced the results yet.
We haven't.
But you would look at how right-wing parties in Europe manifest themselves these days. It's more that they're anti-immigrant than anything else.
Exactly.
And so that's somewhat counterintuitive.
Presumably, it is very counterintuitive.
Presumably, this minister from Afro-European,
Afro-Arabic,
Afro-Arab country.
He knows about that.
Yeah, is perhaps a sending country to Europe, for where migrants leave to go to Europe, and when
he followed that up by saying
the right of center parties in Europe tend to win power and form their coalitions based on sort of anti-immigrant hostility.
Correct, but Austria's
I wrote an article about this way back when in the American Prospect a couple of years ago.
I'm feeling a link coming on.
Completely out of my
is that a link that I feel
it might come up, but
I think you planted the seed. The seed has been planted. No, but here's
the other sort of I think intrigue in Austria that this week is that Jörg Haider, the former sort of right-wing, sort of almost Nazi sympathetic to Nazis at least. Former prime minister of the country died in a car accident in advance of sort of national elections in the country.
And in the fullness of callousness, did that help or hinder Austria's campaign for the Security Council? Some said it helped. Some said it helped. Some said it may have been staged. But this permanent representative of an African Arabic member state went on to say, for example, that while many people increasingly denounced Kurt Waldheim, that there were some countries that didn't. You see what I mean? So anyway, he definitely wasn't referring to anti-immigrant fervors winning the many votes. He was sort of. I've just found that extremely troubling, and in fact, it's not. Having asked around, it may be more of kind of a historical of historical interest. People also said that Haider that Mr. Haider before his untimely demise was once shown for an hour on Al Jazeera and palled around with Saddam Hussein. So there's a sort of an interesting sort of air bridge between interesting or troubling, as the case may be. But so in the run-up, what would be, even though because it's a secret ballot, the not regional but sort of political groupings like the European Union, they didn't announce any guidance to their members on how to vote. Now some people said that although it was not announced, that the whisper campaign within the EU was as follows. Vote for Austria because with the EU losing, Italy has been on the Council for 2 years and is coming off and is obviously an EU member. Yes. Iceland is in Europe but is not an EU member. That for that reason the EU and its own, they use the word institutional memory. To keep institutional memory of the EU alive in the Council, Italy should be replaced by another EU member, i.e. Austria. It's a little weird because obviously the EU has 2 permanent seats with France and England. I mean, and so some people wonder whether if the world weren't more reasonable, those 2 seats might be collapsed into 1.
Yeah.
But so they have 3 now. We haven't said the results yet. Let's take it back. And that also the EU's whisper campaign was vote for Turkey because that way, even if we never let them into the EU, no one can accuse us of being anti-Muslim. I'm putting things in a very graphic way, but that the idea was that this was a kind of an easy vote to sort of salve one's conscience. These are just things that are said here. In fact, this was the result. The vote was called to order at 10 a.m. this morning in the General Assembly Hall.
Yes.
Say again?
I was trying to build up suspense.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Let me not go too fast.
Sound effects.
Oh, right. It was gaveled.
So
it was gaveled to a hold by I don't know if we can call him ex-Sandinista, Nicaraguan priest, Father Miguel Descoto Brockman, the president of the General Assembly for the 63rd year, hammered, gavelled it home, and the ballots were put out. Interestingly enough, on every chair of the General Assembly prior to the vote was a little goodie bag from Turkey involving a mug and some chocolates.
Excellent.
No one quite knows. I asked afterwards what the rules were on that, and I was told anything goes until the voting begins. After that, no gifts can be given. And I'm one country passed out gold Rolexes, but that's before I was here. But this was just chocolates and cups. But and so the voting began, and then was suspended. Was suspended for an hour, apparently to count the votes.
Yeah.
Actually, just a sidebar, Mr. Descoto Brockman then emerged from the building to give a speech at an event. I'm sure, Mark, that you're all over. Stand Up Against Poverty.
Yes, I am all over that.
This year was a little smaller than in previous years because the lawn they usually do it on is being torn up to build a new UN building. Therefore, it was done literally right outside the GA on some grass. They had kids from A Tale of Two Cities. They had a couple of UN officials. They had a very cold wind, and they had Father Brockman giving a speech, not just talking about poverty, but denouncing the greed and selfishness of the developed world. And
to give maybe a little background on this event, Stand Against Poverty is it's in its second year now. It's sort of an international event. It's supposed to mobilize people to talk about to pressure their leaders to take a more proactive approach towards tackling global poverty and towards supporting the Millennium Development Goals. And effectively, it literally is just you're supposed to stand up and be counted among the millions of people around the world who want to sort of make their voices heard. And last year, some 43 million people participated, set a Guinness Book of World Record for people standing at the same time.
I'm wondering
this
if
year,
the third
this
year.
What's that?
I'm wondering if it isn't the third year.
It could be the third year. It could be the third year. I know that last year.
Mark Malloch Graham standing up for poverty on the North Lawn.
Okay. So in this year,
my brain.
It goes from Friday the 17th to the 20th, I believe, or maybe to the 19th through the weekend, and that's it. You're supposed to stand up against poverty.
Yesterday was International Hand Washing Day, by the way.
Yes,
Mark.
I know. It was,
okay, we can go back, and the question on that one.
But let's get back to these the suspense because we still haven't told our
what
viewers
is the sound of one hand washing.
Won.
Okay, the suspense is so. This is why I thought I would even build it up more with the sideline. And the speech that he gave, by the way, was his spokesman says, and in a semi-exclusive, was handwritten by him last night in Spanish by hand. And it was a very, again, what I want to say is, I thought the setup you were going to give is that as the former foreign minister of Nicaragua during the Sandinista era of Daniel Ortega, which is now back in Nicaragua, they gave, as he said when he took the office, they sued the United States for the International Court of Justice for mining, ports and supporting the Contra. But this speech was really, it was out of the norm. Like normally it's just kind of buzzwords and gobbledygook. He really sort of pointed the finger, for better or worse, and then he went back in, and the hall filled, and the reporters were sort of pushed to the side. In previous, at least since I've been here, the previous 2 years we've been able to sort of be right in front and shoulder to shoulder with the people going in. We were sort of penned off to the side, but so be it. And the vote was called, and to most people's surprise, there was no second ballot. It was all resolved in a single fell swoop, as follows. We already did Japan over Iran, but in this WEOG standoff, Turkey emerged with 151 votes, clearly winning the seat. Austria got 133, which was higher than they needed. To win it in the first round, they only needed 128. They got 133. And Iceland, much to its dissatisfaction and to many people's surprise, got only 87 votes.
Sad. Better luck next time to Iceland.
Afterwards they spoke, actually. Usually in these things, everyone's very classy, and everyone, in fact, the sort of non-competitors, it's very interesting to me, of the permanent members, only the Western ones came out and spoke, and they all spoke. UK, US, and France all took to the microphone and sort of welcomed the new ones. At least one of them denounced Iran and said what a travesty it would have been. And I think it was the UK source said they were trounced, they were thrashed.
It was it was kind of embarrassing, I suppose.
I actually thought they might withdraw.
If you're staking your, if you're Ahmadinejad and this is a foreign policy priority of yours, it is sort of embarrassing.
But I don't know, did they call it? I'll say that to the eye here, they weren't campaigning very hard. I think they probably wouldn't have had much of a chance even if they had, but they weren't. So I think that probably for internal consumption, they're going to be able to say, like, they weren't really, because they weren't. I didn't, other than this late surfacing flyer. Yeah. Iceland was the crushing blow, and many people, for whatever reason, people were felt. Everyone that spoke said they felt bad for Iceland, and wasn't it a shame that they tried so hard. They encouraged them to try again. There was one of the issues that came up is that during the financial meltdown, Iceland basically almost went bankrupt, and they announced at one point that their banks would make good on deposits from Icelanders, but not to foreigners. And the UK first threatened to sue Iceland on behalf of its depositors, and then seized Icelandic assets in London of an entirely separate bank. There's some dispute whether they did it under an anti-terrorism law or not. It's an asset freezing law. Today, the foreign minister of Iceland, who I asked, did she think it was helpful what the UK did, said it was very unhelpful and very surprising that the UK would use an anti-terror law against a close neighbor and good friend of 60 years. Yeah. Unquote. So that's a rare statement of the UN.
The terror law was they needed some legal basis to do this, right? And that was the only one that would allow them.
Isn't that kind of an abuse of the law? How can you talk about rule of law?
Yeah, presumably.
Yeah, no, it's very surprising.
But they're not accusing Iceland of terrorism.
But if you cite the law, Iceland thinks they've been accused. Iceland was very. Iceland also said that they were. They said sort of. She said the foreign minister was here. Said sort of ruefully that there had been a number of broken promises. meaning that probably their last-minute vote count had been higher than 87. But again, people go in, when they have a secret ballot, you never know. Somebody here said, I'm not endorsing the statement, that it brought to mind Obama. But I won't. That's really an aside. That's a total wag. Meaning, like, this is what they're calling the Bradley effect. The idea that people may be saying by 14 points they're voting for Obama. Maybe they won't. I don't know. But Iceland felt they got Obama. Iceland faced the Bradley effect, not for racial reasons.
It's nascent anti-Nordic feeling.
I know. And the Nordics were strong. The Nordics were I mean, not only did the Nordics, I think it's uncontrovertible, vote for Iceland, but they were Jan Eliasson, who I know that you're a big fan of, Mark.
Yeah.
He was here, and he was actually actively lobbying for Iceland, leading some to wonder whether he was actually a registered lobbyist for Iceland, because he was through the building saying, "Where's Montenegro on this?"
It's. I think it's useful to point out maybe to viewers that clearly the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are sort of the most powerful, that have the most say, that their veto can block anything, but non-permanent members of the council don't have no power, or to put it more affirmatively, they on issues like sanctions and things like that, require 9 votes to 9 out of 15 votes in the Security Council are needed to approve things like sanctions, and so the votes of these non-permanent members are in fact sort of crucial and in certain sort of key points and on key issues. So
to be cynical about it, Burkina Faso has used its ongoing seat on the council to great effect in terms of foreign aid. Okay. There have been a number of close votes where they have seemingly actively solicited contributions. So it can be actually a money maker, not a money loser. Seriously, but there's a reason that countries so actively seek to be on the Security Council. But it's prestige, but it's also real power as well. But I mean, for example, I asked afterwards. Actually, I think it was pretty interesting. I was glad to say that all 5 winners, Iceland as chastened loser, and the 3 Western permanent 5 members of the council all came out and spoke to the press at a microphone. And I'll have you know, I asked all 9 of them questions. And I asked the Mexican representative that was here, was asked, sort of like Latin America doesn't really show up much in the Security Council, other than the Haiti mission, some remainders of Guatemala justice. Like, for example, the conflict in Colombia never made it on, which is a little hard to understand actually. If you look at in terms of you could compare it maybe to Myanmar, maybe not in terms of political oppression, but in terms of number of people killed and internal seemingly internal strife, but it never shows up. Maybe that's a product of the strength of the Organization of American States, or who knows. But he said he acknowledged that there's he said there's definitely some history between Latin America and the UN, but the purpose of the Security Council is to look globally. I asked him for his thinking on the prospective indictment of the Sudanese president, and he said they're a believer in international justice, and you figure out how we'll vote. Uganda, on the other hand, which got a seat and spoke first afterwards, said in response to the same question that they favor a deferral of prosecution of Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, so that there can be a better reconciliation between justice and the need for stability, unquote. So that's a new...
Okay, I mean, and that's clearly an issue that'll come up, but,
it will come up.
That is an issue that I think the non-permanent members probably don't have as much sway over.
Because you think the 9 votes are no issue. The only issue is whether it'll be vetoed.
I would think so. I would think so, because it wouldn't go forward if there was no prospect of a veto.
Right. No, but I think, what it is? I actually think that in terms of them, I mean, I'm not saying that they're going to try to leverage it for money or aid, but the Western countries that may veto a request to defer prosecution are going to want to be able to point, especially they would love to point to an African country supporting them. And they might get it in Burkina Faso, honestly. They might. I tried to find out from Burkina today how they're thinking. Faso I haven't spoken to yet.
Interesting.
But I'm serious. I think they like to have so even if an outcome is assured, they like to have the ground cover, not just of having raw numbers on their side, but having particular. If you can get an African country to vote with you in a seemingly colonialist position, just joking, then you're looking good, you know? It really does matter which African you get on. Same thing with which Asian, you know?
Yeah.
Japan's game is to try to become so needed in the Security Council that it's just unstoppable that they get a permanent seat.
And so it's been a member of the Security Council many times.
9 times?
In its past. Iceland has never been.
That's why it's sort of a joke. It's like if Japan, they should give it a permanent seat or not, but as it is, there's a rule that you have to step off for 2 years or whatever. So they're basically on for 2 years, off for 2 years, on for 2 years, and then they try really hard. He was asked, the Japanese ambassador was asked, if they think the Security Council is doing enough on North Korea. And he said the 6-party talks are promising, but up and down, and especially on the issue of abductees, which is the totally, third rail of Japan's approach to North Korea. I don't know how many of them there are left, but this is a major issue. He felt that North Korea should do more. And I think that this goes back to your point of why non-permanent members want to be on. They are usually given at least one issue on which they can take the lead. For example, South Africa was, for whatever reason, given East Timor, or Timor-Leste as it's called here. They were the lead, so they set up the trip there. They drafted the resolutions. I mean, it's a little bit random, but in the same way that France is given Ivory Coast and allowed to draft the resolutions, I'm sure that there are countries that are getting on that already have their eye on which one they want to take the lead on, and then
each
you really do have some power.
Gets to be president for a month,
definitely.
And gets to set the agenda as well. And a lot of times they use these to bring up thematic issues like women in conflict.
That's correct. There you go.
Or child soldiers, things like that.
Right. Exactly. Sometimes some of them can't even think of what to do, but usually, no, absolutely. In fact, that would have been a better. Maybe we should have asked each winner what their thematic issue was going to be, but that would have been a little bit. To tell you, the Austrian was very cagey. I asked her what she would do on the Sudan, suspending the prosecution of al-Bashir. Mm-hmm. And she said, we are a strong believer in lack of impunity, and so it was a very strong statement. So I was like, can you imagine, then you're saying there's no circumstances you would vote to suspend. And she said, I'm not going to get sucked into hypotheticals, you've heard my answer. So it's sort of, because to me what's interesting is that you have, it's like with France, you had these grand pronouncements of we'll never agree to impunity, it's terrible. And then Sarkozy came and said, if Sudan does X, Y, and Z, we can suspend it. He said it. He's the president, so it doesn't. The ambassador here and Mr. Kushner may say, never impunity. But from the top of France, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they've laid forth a series of conditions under which they would vote to suspend or not veto. They probably would abstain. I don't think they would vote to suspend. They would abstain. And one of those has now been met. It is reported that Sudan and is confirmed by their government that they have arrested Ali Khoushid, one of the 2 existing indictees.
But hasn't he sort of already been under arrest?
Then they release him and then they arrest him again. It looks good. And to tell you the truth, I think what's funny about it, I agree. Without saying that it's a fake arrest. They did arrest him, right? Which is one of the demands. So I asked the spokesperson for Ban Ki-moon, Michelle Montes, do they have any response to this arrest? And she came back the next day and said, if true, it's a positive step. And then the Sudanese ambassador said, who is she to comment on us? So there you have it.
I'm wondering if we can talk about...
We can transition. We can.
An issue that we talked about last time.
Go ahead.
Which is the General Assembly vote on referring the Kosovo situation to the International Court of Justice. So last time we talked was the eve of a vote, in the General Assembly, to at the request of Serbia, to vote on vote on the status of vote on giving the International Court of Justice, which is in The Hague, which is not the International Criminal Court, the jurisdiction to offer an advisory opinion on the status of Kosovo.
To request an advisory opinion, absolutely, on the legality of. And Serbia won. Serbia won, but did humanity win, Matthew? Did we all? I think to tell you the truth, I think even some countries that abstained, and there were many, if memory serves, 77 voted to refer it to the International Court of Justice, 74 abstained, and 6 voted no. The U.S. and 5 of its 5 islands that it supports.
Yeah.
The European Union en masse abstained. But I spoke to a number of them, even many of them that abstained. I think there's 2 ways to look at it. But I think some of them said, as a theoretical and intellectual exercise, they would have preferred to vote yes, because it certainly does it help international justice to say a country that feels it's been wronged can get a ruling? Mm-hmm. Probably it does, But the reality is they're saying that politically it's not the right time. I mean, I went back and forth. The French ambassador said that Serbia's request would create turbulence. And then I'm told that the French ambassador read him the Riot Act and said you can't use words like that. Just say we're abstaining. And so they abstained, saying that it might not be the right time for this. The big issue became, and when I say Serbia, I said it sort of flippantly that Serbia won. I mean, Serbia, what they say is that to them it's a no-brainer that while this is now pending in The Hague, that no further country should recognize Kosovo. How can you recognize it when it's an open question whether it's legal or not? Ironically, the day after the vote, both the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Montenegro, another of Serbia's breakaway zones, both recognized Kosovar independence.
Yeah.
Ironically, after Montenegro, the day previously had voted with Serbia to send the case to the International Court of Justice. Now, this is a vote that no one can figure out, because if you were going to recognize them, it would seem like you probably, it seems strange to say there's enough of an open question that we should send it to court, but we've already made up our mind. So somebody said to me that there's some Russian business influence in Montenegro that explains all this. So just so people, so our viewers are aware, the U.S. and EU, but particularly the U.S., was applying massive pressure to relatively small states to recognize Kosovo. So it's not, all of the ugliness on this side is not from the Russian and Serbian side. There's I don't know if you call it ugliness, but there's a real arm twisting and even conditioning of aid and of relations on recognizing Kosovo.
Now, Matthew, last time we talked about this, I think you had a theory on why Boris Tadic, the moderate pro-European head of Prime Minister of Serbia, would want to go ahead and do this. And why don't you? It was fascinating at the time, and why don't you rehash
I stand by it. I stand by it.
And I've spoken to sources, and sources seem to have confirmed your theory.
Hello. Even a broken clock is wrong 2 times a day, Mark. No, seriously. The theory can be summarized. The theory can be summarized in, is it 3 words? They want to lose, or they're okay with losing. And the idea is that there is at least some. I was going to say massive, but there's some pretty energetic, and some say wine drinking and window smashing pressure at home in Belgrade to do everything possible to reclaim the birthplace of the Serbian nation in Kosovo. And therefore, the current government, although it wants to get into the EU and it wants to sort of put the past behind it, would itself be under massive pressure and might even be the target of those rocks that were thrown at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade if they aren't perceived as fighting. And so this, for them, is a no-brainer. Number one, they can now return home and say, hey, we did it, you know what I mean? And it's true. Vuk Jeremic, the foreign minister of Serbia, was here like 4 times. They lobbied hard. He's very articulate. And now it works for them whatever happens in 2 years, because they've asked, the Kosovars asked for expedited processing in The Hague, and it's been denied. They've also now more recently asked to be put on an equal footing with Serbia in the court proceeding. I don't think they're going to get that, but I mean, I think who knows what's going to turn out. But on paper, Kosovo can say, and Vuk Jeremic did say, while this is pending, no one should recognize Kosovo. But they can also, the realpolitik of it is, at home, it puts the issue on ice for 2 years. They can say, we did everything possible, but now we have to look like we're waiting for justice to be ruled.
It's a way, in essence, for the moderate Tadic to sideline his sort of domestic, the hardliners.
There we go.
That are part of his domestic.
The only thing is that those hardliners, if I know them well, and if their plum wine is distilled enough, they may see right through this obfuscation, and the rocks may once again fly. And here's the thing: I don't want to. There may be some plum wine drinking opponents, and I just love that. I had a long talk with the guy about who said that many of the protesters in northern Kosovo were bussed in and were essentially football hooligans in motorcycle helmets, fueled up by the name escapes me right now. But there's a Splits? Say again? Slivovitz. There we go. Yeah. No. It sounds great. That these guys were plum wine fueled and bust into Mitrovica to duke it out with UNMIK. Here's one thing I do want to say. There is a very serious. I mean, the UN just looking at it from a sort of an inside baseball, corruption attuned perspective, has been really remiss in the handover of power to Kosovo from UNMIK, because it has never been approved by the Security Council, right? Like Russia's and Serbia's argument is that there was a peacekeeping mission and, in fact, even an interim administration in place, and just because the underlying people declare independence, you can't hand everything over. But they are handing everything over, including, it turns out, several $100 million. And there was an entity established under UNMIK's watch, which was called the Kosovo Trust Agency. And it was, as the name connotes, it was a trust fund into which money from the privatization of state-owned enterprises in Kosovo went. At the time, these were actually Serbian-owned enterprises, right? So the question becomes, what happens with the money? And this money, it's not a question of just giving it to Belgrade. It's that many of this money is owed to the workers, many of whom are ethnically Serb. Like, they worked in the factory, right? So the idea was like it's privatized, but the money's going to be given to them. It was all held in trust. And suddenly, lo and behold, with no approval from anyone, and sort of by force, the Kosovar government has set up its own agency, and the money is gone, and so is the documentation. I'm not kidding you. There are stories from the region of the entire paper files of the Kosovo Trust Agency being burned. And here the UN is like, there's some problems with documentation. And what they'll tell you off the record is like, what could we do? But the reality is that's a lot of money, you know what I mean? And it shows, to me, it's not to look for UN problems, but that's a problem. And I'm also saying, if in fact the UN is being strong-armed by Kosovar authorities in Pristina or elsewhere, they should speak up about it. My sense, gut sense, having looked into the eyes of some of those involved, is that they want the issue to go away. Therefore, even if Kosovo came and stole all their firearms, they're not going to say anything. They're not saying anything. And I can see why, from a Serbian perspective, this would be troubling, because it's not just a legal question. It's like, what's going on here, And
the whole situation is sort of unprecedented in a way, that there aren't sort of
That's why you need a court to rule.
What's that?
That's why you need a court to rule. If I had a ballot, I'm willing to, even as a journalist, say, I think that not only are they within their rights, I think it's a shame it'll take 2 years. I think, to tell you the truth, probably I'm sure that comes off as anti-Kosovar, but it could have, look, the Western Saharas, who we can get to in a moment, they've been waiting for a long time for a referendum. I think the idea would be, right, that's a whole other issue, that's sort of an insider's aside, but it would have made sense for UNMIK itself should have asked for this ruling, before this all happened. But I think that they would.
Hold on a second. If UNMIK asked for this ruling at the ICJ before this happened, the stones would have been hurled at them.
I know. I was about to say that.
But right before, the reason that Kosovo declared independence unilaterally is because the political leaders there could no longer stand power and afford not to. Right. They, I think, have been pretty patient, frankly, with the international system. What
about our friends in Western Sahara?
That was at the Security Council for so long. They knew that the Security Council was never going to approve their independence because of the Russian veto. Yet they were still willing to play along with the Adasari plan, with all these sort of issues, knowing probably full and well that in the end of the day, no matter what they do, Russia would veto. And I give them credit for their patience. At the same time, you can see when their frustration boiled over, and it was taken, and people took to the streets, people rioted, people attacked and killed UNMIK personnel. I can't imagine UNMIK doing something like that.
No. Maybe it sounded flip to you, but I don't
maintain their credibility inside the country.
I don't know if you can make decisions based on who throws the bigger rocks. You know what I mean? I hate to say it. In this case, if you believe in international law, then the right approach would be to get a ruling. And certainly not to just hand over $300 million.
It's sort of, I think, different from a lot of other peacekeeping missions because they were given the trusteeship over the country, right? And a similar situation was in East Timor.
And look how that worked out much better.
Well, I'm just saying, I think in situations where the UN, essentially, the UN Secretariat, is acting in trust of a country, it has to act in that country's best interests, right? Okay. That is sort of, I think sort of the mindset that needs to go into these things.
Then let me ask you.
Again, I think I'm referring to the book Chasing the Flame about Sergio Vieira de Mello. That's something that comes across that sort of is a lesson he learns later in life is that if you're going to be sort of the representative of a country, you need to actually think as if you were like in the country's sort of political elite. You know, if you are representing that country, that you need to keep that country's interests at heart and foremost.
I have a more obscure but I hope poignant question for you.
Okay.
And the question involves Western Sahara.
Yes.
Whose people have been waiting longer than either of the two that we've described.
Right.
Who have a UN mission known as MINURSO that was in fact set up. Its very acronym implies that there would be a referendum whether they could be independent.
Yeah.
And yet the commitment to giving a referendum is entirely gone. And I know I've been accused of being anti-Moroccan for like even covering hearings they've had in the last 2 weeks where a variety of people from Western Sahara come and talk about how terrible things are and et cetera. But there was in fact, and I can't say his name right, Francesco, and it begins with a B, a previous UN special representative of Western Sahara who quit and then emerged here.
It's got to be a thankless job right there, frankly.
No, but here's I guess what I'm saying, okay, he emerged here, he testified to the Fourth Committee, he came and gave a talk to reporters, he said he quit the UN because he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed that despite all the talk about international law and the right to self-determination, that the UN did absolutely nothing for the people of Western Sahara, that the UN allowed the Moroccan flag to be flown above the UN flag in this area in which, legally speaking, Morocco, right, it was a colony that was sort of grabbed after Spain left. And there's this issue, which is sort of a side issue, but that I've been looking into, which is the fishing off Western Sahara, which is that the EU, that paragon of the rule of law, reached a fisheries agreement with Morocco that, while not mentioning Western Sahara by name, is understood to allow European fishing fleets, many of which are from Spain, to fish off the entire coast of Western Sahara and take all the fish. And when there's oil discovered, they'll take, through Morocco paying licensing fees, they'll take all the oil too. And the UN stands by and says nothing. So this guy said he quit because it's a joke. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, it's nice to say the UN, when it's in a place, should have the best interests of the people in mind. What reminds me of that is that that's the legal standard for the UN. Go ahead.
Well, I think not I think the situation in Western Sahara is fundamentally different from that in Kosovo and East Timor, because there's not
they have less of a claim to independence
kind of situation, right? There's no expectation or mandate, frankly, from the Security Council for the UN to
they were supposed to hold a referendum
and build up a sort of nation building.
They were supposed to hold a referendum.
Right, holding a referendum is not like.
But they never did.
Is not,
they never held it.
Right. No, I know. They've been trying to hold it for years.
Well, go ahead and hold it. I mean, I don't know. Again, don't get me wrong. I guess I'm just.
Listen, I should plead some ignorance on this issue.
No, it's very sad. Actually, I will say that, in fact, ironically, if you read Bolton's book about the UN, you'll find him being very pro Sahrawiri, or however you pronounce it.
He is very
not pro. For whatever reason, and I think
I'm trying to recall the person's book. I think at one point he served in some official capacity as a representative to the Western Sahara issue.
Well, there's obviously James Baker.
Whether he was either at the State Department or whether he was at the Justice Department.
But the thing.
I'll have to double check that, but I do recall that being in his book. More
to the point is I had heard, and in fact I wrote, and then I'm glad to say once again, this is the second time the clock was correct, broken clock was correct. It was confirmed to me by an expert who I'll name that the U.S. position in recent years has changed to become decidedly pro-Moroccan, anti-referendum. That the person running the policy in the State Department is one Elliot Abrams, a blast from the past. I'm sure a big fan of Miguel Descoto Brockman of ex-Sandinista, and that it's justified within the State Department as being sort of part of the war on terror, or that Morocco is a strategically important country, and so these people who were promised like everything that supposedly America's fought like 2 wars for in the last decade, freedom and the right to vote, like they don't get it. But here's the expert who really is an expert, but who I hope to trash in 1 minute. Not trash, to question. There's a group, it's very interesting, and so I want to both praise them and then build them up and tear them down. It's called Independent Diplomat. It was founded by an ex-UK mission to the UN diplomat called Carn Ross, and he was here at the UN. I wasn't here, so it did exist. He was here during the run-up to the Iraq War, and wrote a pretty scathing book about how the Security Council was, how the process went, how dissatisfied it went. Make a long story short, once he left, He had a good idea, and he started a diplomatic service for those who need it most. It's a U.S.-registered 501c3 nonprofit that offers or charges for diplomatic advice, how to raise your case at the UN. So, for example, they did represent and advise Kosovo. They're also working with the Sahrawiri of Western Sahara. But they have a certain politics, such that when asked, on the record, if they would consider representing Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they said, well, we can't do anything hypothetical. But they're known to be, they were told, I have sources in Tiraspol, which is the capital of the breakaway region of Transnistria, which is a breakaway region of Moldova, which approached independent diplomat and said, would you even meet with us? And we're told, essentially, you're nothing but a thug republic. We don't meet with thug republics.
They might have a point there when it comes to Transnistria.
They might, but although
they're known as it's a gangster sort of.
Have you ever heard the same thing said of Kosovo? I've heard the same thing said. So I wonder, and the reality, they were asked then, so he came to the press conference, so I asked him about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then two Moroccan journalists that are here who are openly pro-Morocco. We actually disagree vehemently about Western Sahara, but they jumped in and said, who funds your group? And the answer, most prominently, was the Open Society Institute, which I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners will know is a George Soros-funded entity. Now, the irony is this George Soros funding of the president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. Through UNDP, George Soros and the Open Society Institute paid Mikhail Saakashvili extra salary in 2004. Did you know that, Mark? Maybe I've said it before, actually.
But
it's true.
Listen,
it's confirmed by UNDP.
Have all these bizarre conspiracy theories.
It's not a theory. Soros, this is funding. I'm asking you as a UN supporter to justify the UN positioning itself as a middleman for the funding.
Listen, I'm not gonna
Come on.
Come on. I don't know. I know nothing of what you're talking about.
I planted a link, and I'm going to post it. It's true. UNDP has confirmed that they ran a program that was called the Good Governance Program, under which they topped off, they called it, the salary of Mikhail Saakashvili and several senior advisors with additional money, two-thirds of which came from the Open Society Institute. And the question is, Lavrov was here, and I asked Lavrov, what do you think of it? And he said, it's an outrage, and that the UN shouldn't be privatized in that fashion. And for once, or maybe for the 12th time this year, I think they have a point. Whatever your views are of Soros and the Open Society Institute, why in God's name the UN, particularly the UN Development Program, would blithely take what is essentially controversial funding and become the middleman only to take a fee, which they did. I think as a UN supporter, you might want to denounce this.
What do you mean by controversial funding?
I think it's controversial funding. I think that although I think it's one thing to say we like democratization. It's controversial in this way. Number one, the origin of the funding is a person in some regions, characterized as a currency speculator who has destroyed certain developing world economies. There's one, right?
In other regions, he's known as a great philanthropist. That's the definition. Kosovo during the siege of Sarajevo.
And that's the definition of controversial. There are two views, which is why the UN should have just told Mr. Soros, pay the money yourself. What's the problem? Why use the UN as a front for your funding?
I know nothing of this.
I'm asking you before our next Blogging Head section, Mark.
All right.
Well, to come up with a defense.
I think you should, maybe post a link and
I'm going to. I'm sorry, I know I sort of lured you into it. It's a sort of a jiu-jitsu approach, but I think this is again, and I know I was almost uncomfortable making the Soros link because it's not. There are a lot of whack jobs out there. The only thing is that it's not a question that sometimes whack jobs are right. I think as a matter of look, here's a less controversial one. Russia has raised this critique in the last 10 days that the UN should not, at this time, have reached an agreement with the, controversial organization NATO. This is what they say. They say, given what just happened in Georgia, right? Given that the U.S., that in part the attempt to get Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO has in fact increased tensions. Whatever you think of it, that for the UN to reach a agreement with NATO without showing a copy to Permanent Security Council member Russia prior to reaching the agreement was wrong. Right? What do you think? And I guess I'll say in terms of just predicting the future, this is increasingly why some people say that the current SG will have a single term. And this is why these issues
it's the Russian opposition. I mean, at least from what I hear in our conversations with you and from what I read other, that his, Ban Ki-moon's greatest challenge, in terms of staying in power, is with Russia. At the same time,
he might have one with China.
If not he, then who?
Okay, now, Mark, I know that we're near the end here, but here's in the same way that you like the Serbia wants to lose theory, I'm going to sketch out in one paragraph a theory. Here's the theory. The theory is as follows. The theory is Ban Ki-moon has pissed off the Russians, therefore they might even just veto a second term. The theory is Obama wins the presidency, and they want to put their own imprint on the UN. They like the UN, and they view Ban Ki-moon as a Bush choice. Therefore, there's a presidential election in South Korea that happens about a year after his first term ends. Therefore, the theory goes, Ban Ki-moon voluntarily limits himself to one term, and the Asia group gets a commitment to another 10 years, just as Kofi Annan got 10 years after Boutros Ghali. Yeah. And the Obama squad, including Samantha Power, the author of the book that you named, has a lot of input, and they choose as the Asian candidate for the next 10 years, drum roll, Jose Ramos Horta, current president of East Timor, well known to be asking for the commissionership of the Human Rights Council, threw his name into the mix after he was already not on the short list, eager to become ESG.
Already a Nobel Prize laureate.
Exactly. There's only one problem. In the last week, he asked the UN to stop investigating the violent events of 1999 because he wants peace with Indonesia. So the question for Ramos Horta, as the campaign begins, in my head, if nowhere else, is what's your position?
I think entirely in your head.
What's your position on impunity, Mr. Ramos Horta?
Interesting. You are. I think many steps ahead of us. But
I'm telling you, my work here is done. I think I'm ready. They certainly want me to pack up and go, but now I really am because that's the next decade sketched for you, Mark.
Excellent. Okay. Well, there you go. That was. I think that's a great way to wrap it up.
That's a crescendo. Exactly. Yeah, like they do on Seinfeld. I'm going to say, I'm going out on top. See ya.
There you go.
All right. Seriously, that's it. See ya, Mark.